brother and I, we had a fun time. We had a food blog. We lived in a place that had food from 80 countries, and we started going on lunches. We worked at the same company, and so we just, go out to lunch and try something new every day, take pictures, put it on Facebook, didn't take it too seriously, and someone said, hey, you ought to blog this. I've got a couple of pictures to show you. At the end of this, you might think, well, I'm never going to let Brian pick the restaurant again. This is a Nigerian place. This gentleman here is Harun. He's from northern Nigeria. He's on the Muslim side, and he's explained to us about culture, and he asked us the question we would often get, which is, how spicy do you want it? And our response was, however it would be served in the home, that's how we want it. And actually, one of the patrons got up and said, excuse me, sir, you don't understand. This is a different spice that's going to clean you out. And I said, sir, you don't understand. I'm Cajun. I eat Indian food and Pakistani food and this and that. And it came as advertised, I'll tell you. It's the hottest food I ever had in my life. At a certain point, it's less about, your tongue and your mouth, and it's more you can feel bones you didn't know you had radiating. We got to eat a lot of interesting / odd things that you wouldn't think about, that sometimes are privilege. We buy the part of the chicken we want. Let's see the next picture. This is there's Savannah. She's a good foodie with me. That is a chicken foot. They are surprisingly delicious. The first time you have it, you don't think it. You're like, well, I'll just eat it for the picture and for the blog. I'll write about it, and that'll be that. And then after a while, your second or third time, you look over at somebody's plate and they're wasting one. You go, are you gonna finish that one? Can I have that? I got to see a guy make handmade noodles. This guy was an artist. We actually had to slow, when we did the video for him, we had to slow it down in slow motion just so you could see the actions. And it was like choreography. He would take a ball of dough and he would go to noodles that looked like that in about 30 seconds. So pretty impressive. We got to eat some kind of off-the-grid foods. This next one right here had a showing on Wonder Pets. That's a was that too far? This is a guinea pig. It's served kind of as a novelty food at a particular restaurant. That was $70. That's food for about 2 people. So we had a big group. We're like, hey, let's all add $5 to our bill. We get 1 bite, and that's it. It's a little bit like roast duck if you're curious. It's like roast duck if you're not curious as well. But it's called cuy. This is from the Andes Mountains range of Peru and Ecuador. It's actually quite delicious. On the street there, it's probably, a $5 to $10 kind of meal, not $70. We got to see bagels being made. I never knew that they were boiled. My whole life, I thought I didn't like bagels, and it turns out I just like really good bagels. But we had one shop that had, he was actually connected to the bagel guild. There's actually bagel guilds. I never knew that, where you had to make, I think it was something like 500 bagels an hour in your apprenticeship. You had to get to that speed where you could make them that fast. But this gentleman actually married into one of the guilds, and so he was able to carry on the work there. We got to meet a lot of interesting people. This next picture, it was at the restaurant with the noodles. This is a Uyghur family. You might have heard about the Uyghur people. They're in Western China. You hear a lot about them in the news with how the Chinese are persecuting them. We got to hear their stories. We had some amazing experiences. The next picture, we're cupping coffee. And so this gentleman here in the blue shirt, he's got connections all over the world. He's got some coffee from Yemen that a mutual buddy of ours had kind of gotten a shot at to bring to us. It wasn't the best coffee, but the story was amazing. And just the process was super, super interesting. This last picture, I learned something interesting by having these meals. You see, in the church world, I have a lot of opportunities, and you have a lot of opportunities just in your day-to-day life, your week-to-week life, to sit and fellowship with a lot of people. Okay, we call this community, right? You can experience community where you can share life with other people on a regular basis. If you were not in the church, what sector of society would this happen? What's that? Somebody called out an answer. Restaurants, bars, yeah, could be. Yeah, it could be. But there's not necessarily, I guess in some places there could be, but there's not necessarily a sort of geographic connection. During these lunchtimes, this became the most sought-after hour. So this started with my kid brother and I, and slowly other fellow coworkers heard we're doing fun lunches, and like a website developed out of this, and all kind of stuff came out of this, and they wanted to be part. And so in that picture, like there's probably about another half dozen people that would go with us regularly. There's not a person there that I hadn't spent time at some point, both in the office and outside, praying with. You go, well, how did you pray with coworkers? Well, you develop this time over lunches where they start talking about their family problems and their struggles. And at some point you go, hey, I don't want to weird you out, but, I believe in God and I'd love to pray for you if you'd let me. And then after a while they start seeking you out. There's not a person up there and others that I didn't pray with, I didn't counsel at some point, that even we didn't have into our home at some point. Now, I don't want to portray this as all roses. If I were to go across person by person, the lady all the way on the right, her husband's in some kind of sort of positivity cult. They actually attended an online Bible study with me during COVID, so it was a mixed bag there. The lady next to her, she was very proudly the most pagan person at the office and let everybody know it, and as far as I know, still is today. The man in the middle, one of my dearest friends, love him to death. He grew up in a very staunch Catholic home in Venezuela, and he was an illegitimate child, was never recognized by his father. Obviously, there's huge, very deep-seated issues going on there. As far as I know, not a believer. There's, me, I'm the next person there. We got huge worries about that person. And then the person right there on my right is my kid brother. I love him to death. He's my closest sibling. He's not walking with God right now. And so I don't want to, in today's sermon, obviously we're going to be talking about eating. That's the next word in the series. So last week was bless, and today is going to be eat. I don't want to paint this as, well, this is a silver bullet. This is a magic pill. Just do this one thing, and all of your friends, all of your family, all of your office, they're going to become believers. No, it's a struggle. It's going to take time. You're going to be doing life with them. But it's a valuable journey. If you would turn to Acts chapter 2. So this is the second sermon in this series on planting the desert, 5 practices for bringing life to spiritual wastelands. The first one was bless, and I asked you, make a commitment to bless some people this coming week. And there's a kind of a caveat, one of whom is not a Christian, right? So be a blessing to those around you. We should be a blessing to the household of faith, but be a blessing to those outside the household. God's promise to Abraham to be a blessing didn't extend just to him, but it extended to all of the families of the earth would be blessed through Abraham. And God calls us to be that kind of blessing. Did you bless anyone this week? Today we're going to talk about eating. And let's go ahead and read. This is Acts chapter 2, verse 42 and following. And it says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. And awe came upon every soul. And many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were gathered together and had all things in common. They were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. So this passage right here is one of a couple of summary passages in the book of Acts. So Luke will tell a little bit of the story, and then he'll give a summary statement of how are things going. And so essentially, in the book of Acts thus far, they've chosen an apostle to replace Judas, and then the Holy Spirit has arrived at Pentecost and has filled them in a new way, and some interesting and crazy things are happening in chapter 2. And by the end of chapter 2, there's this summary statement. And there's 4 essential practices in this statement that we're going to look a little bit today. Obviously, I'll focus the most on the eating portion. But number 1 is the first practice that they did that really changed the world. These are practices that changed the world. The first one was devotion to God's word. It says they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. Now, what did the apostles have at that time? Not a lot. We have the gift of God's word, and I say that quite literally. We have infinite numbers of colors and options and bindings and translations, and you can get any version and option of the Bible that you want. Also, we have all of these things electronically as well. But the apostles could have had the scrolls, but these probably would have been kept in the temple. It's not like you would have your own copy. If you buy a handwritten copy of the Old Testament, so in Jewish synagogues today, they typically have a handwritten copy. Those cost about $65,000, $75,000 in today's money to own one. So it's not like they're walking around with one of these under their arm, aside from the fact that it takes years to make one. So they would have probably their teaching and their instruction that they had in temple, in synagogue. They were obviously still worshiping in the synagogue and in the temple, so that was still part of their life. They hadn't completely separated out of the Jewish tent yet. But a lot of this would have been their own testimony, their own eyewitness accounts. Okay? And so they are teaching the scriptures and the things that people, it says, they devoted themselves to, they dedicated themselves to the apostles' teaching. Barna did a study on churches that are growing and churches that are dying, and they said one of the main ways of understanding our church is growing, our church is healthy, one of the number one things that they identified as a characteristic, this is going to shock you, is that they read the Bible. Right? Like, we always think, like, what's the new growth strategy? What needs to be the music on stage? And how should the pastor dress? And what translation should they use? And how long should the sermon? There's all these studies on that. And there's basically goes, look, if you're reading the Bible every day, you're going to grow spiritually. And if you're not, you're probably not. It's a very simple thing. This is why this year we've got the challenge of reading through the scripture. I've been so encouraged how many people have joined us in that challenge to read through the scriptures again this year. It's a great challenge. If it's your first time or your 50th time, do it again with us. It's very important that we are constantly devoted to the Word of God. The next thing that they were devoted to, though, was community. It says they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship. So we can think of fellowship as a verb, like we are fellowshipping together, but in this it's the noun, the fellowship. This word is koinonia. You've probably heard this a lot if you've been in church for a while, and it has this idea of association, communion, fellowship, close relationship. But in this context, it's in the context of breaking bread and prayers. It's not just we're hanging out, we're watching movies together. There's a spiritual context that this community is happening in. One of the authors I read this week, he said, the meaning then would be that they devoted themselves to a fellowship that was expressed in their mutual meals and in their prayer life together. They devoted themselves to fellowship expressed in mutual meals and prayer time together. And so those things were not being separated. It wasn't, well, we're going to go fellowship in this box, we're going to go eat in this box, we're going to go pray in that box. It was, these things began to be wrapped up all together. The third thing that they were devoted to was the breaking of bread. Now, people disagree on what is this breaking of bread because there's a number of things it can be and probably, honestly, was. It probably was a bit of all of them. Number one was this probably included the Lord's Supper. They were probably celebrating this on a weekly basis, even a daily basis, because Jesus told them to remember his death until he comes. But there's another thing that they did back at this time. It's called agape feast or love feasts. This only gets mentioned by name twice in the New Testament, and in both, Paul and Jude, they're correcting abuses in the love feasts. But a love feast, it was a time where they would gather together and have all things in common. You want to know something fascinating? If you read some of the early Roman writings, the secular Roman writings that were written against Christians, here's the accusations and the charges they brought against Christians. Cannibalism, incest, and atheism. You go, wow, they're so misunderstood, right? That's identifiable, relatable. Okay, let's look at this one by one. Cannibalism. Well, they eat and drink of the Lord's body. To an outsider who doesn't understand that we are symbolically doing this, it sounds a little pagan. Also, Rome was home to many, many, many religions that included all kinds of weirdness. We'll talk about that in a sermon series later in the year when we go through Corinthians. So it wasn't that far-fetched in the Roman Empire that could be happening. Incest. At these love feasts, everyone called each other brother or sister. And so, a Roman soldier walks by and hears all of these seemingly unrelated people, or perhaps related people, even worse, calling each other brother and sister. And what do you do with that? Well, they assumed it was incest. And then atheism, how can you accuse Christians of atheism when clearly we believe in God? But they rejected all of the Roman gods. And so that is why they believed that Christians were atheists. And so many of the early Christian writings were defending against these claims. But in these love feasts, there were certain extremes that it went to. In some extremes, it became a pity meal for the poor, where the rich would come and they would just kind of lavishly, we're going to show our power and our strength by just giving you a pity meal. And then on the other side of the extreme in the spectrum, it became sort of a lavish banquet for the rich, where they celebrated it almost by themselves. Several years later, the Lord's Supper was actually separated out of these love feasts. And so the two were done kind of distinctly. But for several hundred years of church history, they were done together, where the Lord's Supper was celebrated at a full-on kind of potluck fellowship meal, if you will. One of the early governors of Pontus is northern Turkey, he wrote to the Roman emperor at the time, and he's criticizing the Christians, and here's what he criticized them for. He says, they would meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a god, and they would bind themselves by oath to abstain from committing fraud, theft, or adultery. When this was over, it was their custom to depart and assemble again to partake of food. Ordinary and innocent food. He couldn't understand their love for each other. Now, he is writing the Roman emperor saying, hey, what should I do with these Christians? Here's what they're doing. But he's also saying, hey, they have some weird practices where they're eating together. Christian meals at this time had a different ethos than Roman meals. Roman meals were based around impressing guests by gaining favor. They're having you over so that you will do something in return. They're having important people over. It's favoritism. I'm going to have you over to my house because you're important and you'll open doors for me and my family. And so I'm going to roll out the red carpet. I'm going to kill the fatted calf for you. I'm going to impress you. And then I'm going to ask you for something in return. Christian meals, by contrast, they focused on including the poor, the needy, and those who couldn't repay. In fact, Jesus says as much. Don't have people over only who can have you back. Meals were an essential part of this time. They broke bread daily together. And they did this with gladness. They did this with joy. The fourth thing they committed themselves to, and I've already alluded to this, is to prayer. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, the fellowship, the breaking of bread, and the prayers. This is possibly a reference to the official Jewish prayer times. Many religions have official Jewish prayer times. Muslims are well known for this, to have the 5 daily prayers. Muhammad didn't invent anything new. He borrowed this from the Eastern Church. They had 7 daily prayers. It's not about who has more prayers each day, but it could be a reference to that. But with the association of it being house to house, this has to be a kind of prayer that people are performing with and for each other, not just daily prayers of going to the synagogue or going to the temple. And one of the things that comes out of this, it says, there were wonders. Verse 43 says, and awe came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. So this is a summary time of what is the result of the first little bit of Acts. The result is all of these things were happening, and there were wonders being performed by them, signs being done through the apostles. There's one of the early church theologians, his name is Aquinas, and he stood before Pope Innocent II. And someone was giving a large sum of money and laid it out before the Pope. And the Pope looked at all of this money and he announced to the room, he says, no longer can we say silver and gold have we none. And Aquinas quipped, but neither can we say rise up and walk. You see, there was something about this time that wasn't built around the structures that we think of as the church. When we think of a strong, growing, healthy church, we can often think of sort of physical structures. Do they have a good leadership team? Do they have a winsome pastor? Do they have a nice building and facility? Do they have the programs? But the reality is these characteristics are what led the church into this time. One of the characteristics it lists also is that they had all things in common. In having all things in common, what does this mean? He explains it. It says, verse 44, and all who believed were together, and they had all things in common. They were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. They were doing life together. They were selling the extra things that they had, and they were giving it to those who had need. There's some qualities here. There's a unity. They were working together. There's an identity. We are the people of God. There's a participation. They were all involved in this. People weren't sitting there on the sidelines going, yeah, I don't think we should take care of those poor people. Those poor people should get jobs. Yeah, I don't think we should be praying together. We're praying too much. That's kind of not what I do. Right? There wasn't people sitting on the sidelines. They were all participating in this together. And then there was a direction, there was a purpose towards this. Later, one of the other summary passages said, and no one had any need amongst them. Verse 47, they were practicing out what it meant to be a blessing to the nations. They were blessed to be a blessing. They saw this. They took their resources and turned it into a blessing for others. What did this gain them? Verse 47, it says, praising God and having favor with all the people. Last sermon, I played that video that was a little hard to watch of the man on the street interviews of, what do you think of Jesus? Typically, people had very positive views of Jesus. Now, what do you think of Christians? That's where it got a little cringy. It was hard to watch, but that's not the man on the street interview here. If the worst thing that a governor like Pliny could say is, you know what, they sing really loud and they praise Jesus as God and they have people in their homes and there's no more poor people. That'd be amazing. There was one emperor who came very shortly after this. So Rome went through a series of emperors. Most of them had a very antagonistic view towards Christianity. At a certain point, Christianity became an accepted religion. Not only an accepted religion, became the state religion of Rome. And Christianity definitely changed after this time. But there was one emperor who was out of sync with this timeline, who did not adopt the state religion, even after it was the state religion, and he took up the mantle to again persecute Christians, and his name was Julian. Emperor Julian did not like Christians. He saw this kind of behavior, that they had all things in common, that they cared for the poor and the lowly. They did things without thinking of themselves or without thinking of anything in return. And he did not like this. In his writings, he would talk about how they cared for the poor, how they cared for the lowly. And because of all of this love, the masses were turning to Christ. The masses were abandoning the Roman gods and the Roman religion, and they weren't worshiping the emperor anymore because of all of this love for the unimportant, the non-Roman citizens, the outcasts, the foreigners. In fact, he was so turned off by this that he created state programs. He created state programs to try to take care of the poor. But the Christians were motivated by a deep foundation in God's love for them, a deep foundation in the idea that God blessed them to be a blessing to the nations. You can't muster that kind of passion through government programming. Obviously, that program didn't last. It failed. There's something about meals. There's a number of sacred meals in the Bible, and we can look at this time where the fellowshipping and the breaking bread house to house goes with the prayer and everything else. And they seem inseparable, but it's not just a New Testament phenomenon. As we look through sacred meals throughout the Bible, there's one famous one where Abraham is sitting there in his tent, and there's these three visitors who walk by. And he calls them over and makes them sit down. And he calls out to his wife and he says, hey, make a little dinner for us. And then in your translation, it talks about like shias of flour. And we don't know what a shia is. But basically, it's enough flour and it's enough meat that they put on. You could feed 60, 70 people. That was hey, let's have a little snack here. They made a feast for these three visitors. Now, in that story, turns out one of these visitors seems to be kind of a pre-incarnate appearance where God has come down and he is visiting with Abraham. He's put himself in some kind of human form. Two of the angels go down into the city, and one stays with Abraham. It's a very dramatic scene as Abraham is interceding over Sodom and Gomorrah. This is one of the most vivid chapters in the Bible. And Abraham is interceding over Sodom and Gomorrah, and the angels go down there. But all of this happened over a meal. The angels go into Sodom and Gomorrah, and the flip side of this coin is there's Lot down there in Sodom and Gomorrah. And again, we see another meal come into play. These men are going to stay in the city square. And Lot looks at them and says, you can't stay in the city square in Sodom and Gomorrah. He knew what would happen. He knew how dangerous it was. And he says, you have to come in my house. And they did this whole Middle Eastern rule of threes. Oh, I couldn't possibly come in your house. No, really, you must come. Oh, I couldn't possibly. No, you must come. I can't. Okay, come. Right? They did that whole thing. It records it in the Bible. And they came there, and just like Lot thought, the men of the city stormed the house. It turned out very, very badly. It was very ironic where he tried to save them, but they were really sent to save him. But again, it was this kind of hospitality. It was this hospitality that became the centerpiece where this happened and played out. Christine Pohl says, Lot's story demonstrates that when hospitality is contrary to the intentions of the larger group, it can be dangerous, an act of defiance, a challenge to the unity and expectations of the community. Their community ethos and value was when outsiders come in, they are for us to exploit. Now, Lot, you're sitting here in the city, and you said you're going to protect these guys. That is out of sync with who we are. It is countercultural. There's a story of a widow and a prophet named Elijah. And Elijah goes to stay with this widow and basically says, hey, would you give me a drink of water? And she goes to get the drink of water. He's like, while you're getting that water, would you make me some bread? And she's like, sir, you don't understand. We just have this little bit of oil and this little bit of flour, and I'm going to make this last loaf of bread, and this is for me and my son, and we're going to eat it, and we're going to die. And he says, you know what? Make it for me first. And it takes a lot of backbone to hear that story and say, but I'm hungry. But he does. Now, I mean, he knows something, right? God has given him instruction that the oil and the flour aren't going to run out. And they see this miracle happen over a meal where she makes the flour, she makes the bread out of the flour and the oil and feeds him, and the flour and the oil continue to be replenished. And then this thing happens where her son dies, and there's this prayer where Elijah's just calling out to God, like, God, what are you doing? Like, I'm here eating this woman's last piece of bread, her son dies. Why? He raises him back to life. All of this is centered around this act of sharing a meal together. You could look at any Jewish holiday throughout the Old Testament, and there's meals involved. Think of the Passover, think of Purim, think of Hanukkah. A little outside of the Bible, but think of Hanukkah. A Jewish person told me one time, they said, Jewish history looks like this. They tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. And I mean, they're right. Like, every holiday involves eating. We could look at the meals of Jesus. One commentator said, in the book of Luke, Jesus is either going to a meal, he's at a meal, or he's on his way from a meal in the book of Luke. A meal was how he told his disciples to remember him. Not a pilgrimage, not an amazing act, not some conquering act, but every time you eat, and he picked the most basic things up off the table. What they were drinking and the bread. These were things they had at every meal. Every time you do this, do it in remembrance of me. A meal was how he revealed himself to his disciples after the resurrection. They were all sitting there in fear, and he came to them. There are many other meals of Jesus that I'm just going to skip over. One, there's too many, and two, I'm going to have a sermon series later this year on the meals of Jesus, so I don't want to steal from that. But they were an essential part of Jesus' ministry. There's the messianic banquet that's going to happen at the end of the age. This is the marriage feast where Jesus has come for his bride. That's us. And he's brought us back to heaven with him. And he is the one who is making the food and preparing the meal and bringing us to sit down and eat together. In Revelation 19:9, it says, and the angel said to me, write this, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. Hospitality is a command in Scripture. I'm just going to go through some scriptures here quickly. Romans 12:13 says, contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality. The Bible instructs us to have hospitality without grumbling. 1 Peter 4:9, show hospitality to one another without grumbling. It's one of the standards of who would be qualified as a widow that the church was responsible to serve and to take care of. Widows who had offered hospitality, who were hospitable people, the church was responsible for taking care of them when they could no longer take care of themselves. It was one of the requirements for being an elder or a deacon. In Titus 1:8 it says, but an elder must be hospitable, a lover of good, self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. Hospitable. There was a way of possibly entertaining angels, and maybe this is a reference back to that Abraham story I told, but Hebrews 13:2 says, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unaware. Meals are how we see Jesus in others. This one might seem different until you remember the words of Jesus who said, if you've offered a cup of water to the least of these, you've offered it unto me. Inasmuch as you've done it to the least, you've done it unto me. This is how we see Jesus in others. Meals play an essential part in our practice as a church, in our practice as individual Christians. I want you to look at the result in the text here, verse 47. It says, praising God and having favor with all people. So their name and their reputation, people understood who they were and what they were about. And then this last line, and the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. The Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. Growth is something that's in God's hands. There are books and seminars and classes you can take on church growth and how to make it happen. There are people who've looked at mission movements around the world of how did churches, how were they planted and how did they spread in particular countries. And they'll use words like, well, we reverse engineered this. We distilled the principles. And if we do these things, then God will do something else. God will cause the growth. We can cause God to cause the growth. It's kind of this very mechanical view of seeing God. But the reality is growth is something that's in God's hands. We just have to set the table. I showed that picture early on of the group, and I said, hey, here's the exciting things. I got to pray with them. I got to counsel them, and then I gave you the realistic picture, but they're not believers yet. I'm okay with this. I've learned to live with this tension of God called me to do something, and it may not have shown the fruit that I was hoping for, that I wanted, but that's because I understand that He is the one who's going to bring them to Himself, not me. I did my part. Literally, set the table. We sat together. We ate together. We talked together. I shared the story of Jesus with them. He's the Messiah, not me. But there's challenges in eating, just like there's challenges in blessing. And one of the challenges in eating is that Roman challenge. It's the challenge of selfish ambition. Philippians 2, do nothing from selfish ambition, but think of others more highly than yourself. Put others' needs ahead of yourself. We too can be very selfish in our ambition, where we see hospitality or we see meals as networking. If you're in business, there's nothing wrong with networking. That's fine. But that's very different. Networking and career building is very different than what is our role as Christians to eat and to have hospitality with others. Another challenge in eating is favoritism and inviting people who can repay. We wind up with friends. Not that it's wrong to have our friends over. I love having meals with my friends. But again, this is not the same as Christian hospitality. Christian hospitality needs to extend beyond me and my buddies, me and the people that I enjoy their company. The third challenge is there's having too much or too little. These are kind of similar challenges on the opposite side. If you have too much, you say, well, why is that a challenge in eating? Well, when your stuff is too nice, what do you want to do? I can't have people in here. They're going to get this nice new carpet all dirty. They're going to mess up that nice brand new sofa. I can't open up my home because of what will happen to all the nice stuff. So having too much can be a barrier to eating with others. But also having too little. I can't have people in here. Man, the floors are messed up. Oh, there's a hole in the wall. Oh, there's this, there's that. My house is too small. What will they think? They live in that really fancy neighborhood, and I'm over here in this neighborhood. What will they think of me, right? It becomes kind of an ego trip for us or an ego dive for us. Christine Pohl says, with urbanization and industrialization, so like with the growth of cities, the household has become smaller and smaller and more private. It is a cherished retreat from the world into which one admits a few strangers. It's a cherished retreat from the world. Now, she's not saying this in a good way. She's critiquing this. I had the practice when I was a professor. I'd always have my students in at the end of semester. We do a gumbo night. I make a big pot of it's a Cajun soup. Make a big pot of this and have all my students in. And every year I had students that were shocked. And one finally just kind of put it on the nose. She said, "Do you always have strangers into your home like this?" I said, "Well, you're not strangers. You're my students." She goes, "Wow, when I go home, I don't want anybody in my home. That's my space. It's my, right?" She was living this out of, I built this little kingdom and I'm going to keep it safe. I will do everything with everybody out there, but this is my private space. Christine Pohl goes on to say, she says, the future of Christian hospitality is partly tied to the future of the home and family. Recovering hospitality will involve reclaiming the household as a key site for ministry, and then reconnecting the household and the church so that the two institutions can work in partnership for the sake of the world. So the commitment I'm challenging you with today, as you might have imagined already, is to eat with some people. Right? I have that. If you've got the note handout, there's a statement there that says, I will eat with 3 people each week, one of whom is not a Christian. I want to challenge you to take this. Now, you're going to say immediately, you're thinking, well, but I'm too busy. Okay, you're eating, right? Or are you too busy to feed yourself? I've had people tell me this before, oh, I'm busy that day, I can't meet. Well, are you eating lunch that day? Because I'm eating lunch that day too, and I'm happy to make the drive. I'll come to a place that's convenient for you, and let's eat that day. It's not like we're going to sit and fast that day. There's 21 meals in the week. This is 3 meals out of 21. It's not a lot when you think of it that way. Also, I mean, if you really want to cut corners, you have 3 people to the same meal, and then it's 1 meal out of 21. Now, look, I didn't preach a whole sermon just to say this next thing, but it did dawn on me. If you have not sat down and had lunch or coffee with me, I can be one of your people. If you look around the room and realize you don't know the people around you, and it's been this way for years, there might be a problem. And it might be that we're not taking that step to sit and eat, to sit and have a cup of coffee or a piece of dessert together. Paul, in many places throughout the New Testament, he talks about people who aren't walking in his teaching, or who aren't walking according to the way of Christ, or who are living immoral or dark lives. And in many places, he instructs not to associate, not to fellowship. And at one point, he even says, don't even eat with that person. If we were to look at the status of Christian hospitality throughout the church, I'm not meaning Mountain View, meaning the church. There are people that we have cut off unintentionally. We're treating them as if they are outside the faith, like Paul said, only it has nothing to do with any kind of moral failing. It's just we can't be bothered. This highlights this ban that Paul put. If our default is to already have people outside of fellowship, how do you put them outside of fellowship? Because we're already too insular. One thing I would like to highlight for you as a way of potentially achieving this goal of eating with 3 people a week. We have dinner 8 groups happening right now. The sign-up is still open. You can get into a dinner 8. Right, that at least fulfills the non-Christian part. I don't know, maybe the Christian part, maybe the non-Christian part too. Oops, I messed up and said the truth there. But in all seriousness, right, this does fulfill a portion of that. Now, here's the challenge: as we think of like the bless and the eat, I mean, I reflect back on my week and I go, okay, did I bless 3 people this week? One of whom is not a Christian. I have to pause and think about that, because what does it take? I think, well, what did I do on Monday? What did I do on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, right? And then I'm standing right here, right now. It requires me stepping out of my normal patterns. It requires me having eyes that are open as I drive through town to think, how can I bless someone? When I pull up into my neighborhood, I can't just walk in the door and close the door and that's it. I have to think about, well, who are my neighbors? How could I bless one of them? The same is true of Christianity. It's easy for me to just do my job of pastoring and just kind of stick to that. it requires some life change for us. If I think, well, I'm going to have meals with 3 people, I have 21 meals and 3 of those are going to be with others, or 1 with 3, it requires some pattern change. If I just like my pattern of, I'm working from home and I stay at home and I'm never going to get out, particularly that one of having a meal with someone not of the faith, how am I going to have a friendship and a relationship outside of this room, outside of my Christian friends, to the degree where we go and we have a meal together? It requires some lifestyle change, some pattern change for us. Just a point of encouragement, meals can be very, very simple. We always overthink things if they have to be these lavish productions, and they don't. That's Roman hospitality. Our hospitality can be something very simple. It could be coming and having coffee together, dessert nights, a plate of cookies or a baked loaf, bring it to new neighbors. There's always that awkward phase of like a new neighbor moves in and you're busy and you should meet them, but then like a time happens, you realize, well, now if I go meet them, I'm already supposed to kind of know them, and it gets awkward. So just purpose, when someone new moves into the neighborhood, just put it on the calendar, make that plate of cookies, go knock on the door and say hi. It takes away all the awkwardness later. Meals can go hand in hand with being a blessing. These practices don't have to work opposite of each other. They can go hand in hand where someone is sick, and you go, well, I'm going to bless them. How can we bless a sick person? I'm going to bring them, a pot of stew or something. Someone's having a baby. Someone is in the hospital. Someone's family member passed away. These are times where having a meal can be important. Having meals together, it's not about providing a service. It's not about feeding the hungry necessarily. That might be a component of it, but it has to do with spending life together. It has to do with sharing life. And this becomes kind of a way of life for us. So last week we looked at bless. This week we looked at eat. I think there's a way where you can put bless and eat together, where one can help the other. Let's pray. God, you are a relational God. You don't just set up transactions with us. You call us into relationship with you, and in many points throughout the Bible that we've looked at today, this involved sitting and eating. I think even of the old temple, there were 12 loaves on the table, loaves of bread. There's 12 tribes of Israel. It's almost as if you're saying, when you come into temple, here's the bread. I am here to meet and eat with each of you. One for each of you. God, we think through our list of neighbors and coworkers and friends and relatives and even church members. And God, I pray that you would put people's names on our mind. Who can we sit and have a meal with? Even if it's a simple meal, a cup of coffee, a cup of cold water. How do we bless those around us? How do we bless them through eating, through time together? It's less about the food and the production and the performance and more about that time and caring and spending time with them and just saying, hey, how is your week going? It's not every day that people have that experience where they can sit down and just share. God, I pray that you would be leading us and committing to blessing those around us, leading us and committing to eating with those around us as well.